So, this came out from the Evening Standard yesterday, or well, a couple of weeks ago now, depending when this video comes out. But this is the 7 deadly trade lies that Brexiteers tell, and it's written by a guy called Grant Lewis, who's the economic guy over there at the Standard. Now, he's right in his preamble. Look, Brexiteers are trying to tell this wonderful lie, well, this wonderful new bizarre thing that Brexit was really a core thing of it was all about free trade and how free trade they are, and they're all about the free trade. And yet, when you look at their claims and their glances, you realise that, hold on a second, they're trying to substitute something which is incredibly good with a potential market of over 500 million people basically right on our doorstep, with something subpar that will just not replace it. This is, and it's so funny when you see people, when these guys make this argument, because they don't stand up to scrutiny. So the first one you see is the European Union is a protectionist cartel. I have seen this loads of times. And Grant's response to this is the biggest lie of all. The EU has more free trade agreements than the US, including with South Korea, Mexico and Canada, and one with Japan in the pipeline. As a result, the average tariff rate imposed by the EU. So remember, this is something Brexiteers are told, oh, the tariffs are so high, my God, look how big the tariffs are. The average tariff imposed by the EU are below 3%. Oh my God, how protectionist. They're below 3%, and yet that's lower than any in the US. And currently, you've just had the US jack their tariffs, 25% on aluminum and 10% on steel and I want to say iron, but it's not. It's something else. But yeah, and yet you have so these people have the gall to call the EU protectionists when they have some of the lowest tariffs around. So the second one, and this is an interesting one that I want to read out. So the second one is free trade agreements deliver free trade. So the response to this is yes, they largely eliminate tariffs, but they do little to remove the non-tariff barriers, which are much more important for rich countries, and do little to reduce barriers affecting services, which, remember, 80% of our economy is based on services. So a Canadian-style free trade agreement with the EU will mean that car manufacturers will still be able to sell cars into the EU tariff-free, but only provided that the car adheres to EU standards, and that the manufacturer builds a huge bureaucracy to handle the paperwork and rebuilds its supply chain to deal with border delays and subsidy requirements. Oh, hang on. And satisfy requirements on rules of origin, whether car manufacturers think the additional costs or leaves all their UK operations profitable is another matter. But what is indisputable is that outside the single market, a London-based bank which previously used EU passporting rights to provide services to EU clients will no longer be able to operate in the same way. That is why financial service firms are moving people and capital and tax receipts associated with them to new subsidiaries in the EU. So the new one, and this is, you'll see this play into a lot of, oh, the Commonwealth, oh, well, we'll be plugged into the Commonwealth, it'll be amazing. So number 3, they claim, is we need new free trade agreements to trade with the world. Again, total nonsense. The lack of a free trade agreement doesn't stop German exporters trading very successfully with China, for instance. The fact that the UK's goods exports to China are only a fifth of Germany's is patently not down to a lack of a free trade agreement. So, number 4, free movement of labour is not required for free trade. The response, of course it is. One only has to consider the case of lorry drivers working across the EU or people providing cross-border services to realise that the ability to work without hindrance across the EU single market is crucial. So, number 5. You don't need a common legal framework to have free trade, which is the big gripe that a lot of Brexiteers have. And this is what a lot of people can't understand. And basically, when they say, oh, why can't we just walk away? The EU is more than just this trade bloc. There's a lot of legal framework that goes into it. So his response is, I'm afraid you do. The beating heart of the world's only true multinational free trade area, the EU single market, are its common regulatory and legal systems. Only through their existence has the EU been able to eliminate non-tariff barriers and to free up trade in both goods and services. And, you need these legal frameworks in place to be able to do that. But again, these Brexiteers don't understand that. So this is the other one. We've talked about this before. Distance no longer matters. We've talked about this before, and I can already see the comment coming up. So his response is utter nonsense. There is a rock-solid statistical relationship that the degree of trade between countries is in a large part determined by geographical proximity. There is a reason that the UK exports around 4 times more to Ireland than to India, and it's got nothing to do with a lack of a free trade agreement with India. And that's the big thing. They're claiming, oh, we can trade with all these Commonwealth countries, which are, halfway around the world. You don't, I explained this back when we were talking about the whole Commonwealth nonsense, when that was the big thing Brexiteers were on about. Which they're suspiciously quiet on now, which, surprise, surprise, we explained why in that video it won't work. The Commonwealth is not an economic trade bloc like the EU is. It is built on historical ties rather than geographical importance. And in trade, geographical importance is far more important to trade than, historical ties. So this is the final one, and this is the big one. So free trade agreements can make up for what we lose on leaving the EU, and this is their big hope, that somehow we'll get all these amazing free trade deals. Remember, they said people would be queuing up to do deals with us. No one is. We've already got Australia and New Zealand threatening us to take us to the World Trade Organization courts, where they can force us to accept new terms. Remember, guys, you left because you apparently wanted this sovereignty. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. This is so naive to think that way, because you have to follow somebody's rules. And honestly, I'd rather follow the EU's rules than anybody else's. So, his response to this is, free trade agreements actually do very little to boost growth. Indeed, there is no scenario where any number of free trade agreements could ever make up for the economic damage caused by the UK leaving the customs union and the single market. This is indisputable. To paraphrase one of Britain's most eminent economists, the so-called free trade Brexiteers follow an ideology based on the economics of a first-year undergraduate who only listens to a third of his or her lecturers. Even the most feckless of undergraduates learns that free trade is good, but only those who listen to the other two-thirds of their lectures learned what free trade actually entails. Removing non-tariff barriers to trade, particularly in services. That is precisely what the EU single market, so enthusiastically championed by Margaret Thatcher, has delivered. Reintroducing barriers to trade with the world's largest single market and the destination for almost half of the UK's exports is not promoting free trade. Quite the opposite. Indeed, Brexiteers' favoured new custard agreement with the EU would, according to the HMRC estimates, cost businesses an additional 70 billion to 20 billion a year. Far from delivering free trade, the Brexiteers are actually leading the UK towards its most significant imposition of new barriers to trade since the last war. They really should have paid more attention to their lecturers. And that's the sum it up. There's no other way you can sum it up than that. This whole lie and pillar of that now is becoming that Brexit was all about, it's about free trade, global Britain, is absolute nonsense. If you were really about free trade and, all this stuff you are talking about, you would want to be a member of the EU, you wouldn't believe in the single market, and you wouldn't believe in the customs union. So, yeah, there you have it. There's no other way to talk about it really than it's just completely dumb. Their economic arguments make no sense, and this is why there's so much division in the cabinet, because the Leave campaign ran such a vague campaign of what they actually wanted. Remember, you can go back and you can hear people who are campaigning for Leave basically saying, we'll leave the EU, but we'll stay in the single market and the customs union. And then you've got others saying, we'll stay in the single market, but we'll leave the customs union. Others saying, we'll leave the single market, but stay in the customs union. Remember, Daniel Hannan infamously said, only a fool would leave the single market. You're lost for words. But the stupidity on show of what these people want doesn't make sense. It really doesn't.